There are moments in life when you feel the world slip away, when the weight of existence lifts, and you're suspended in a fragile bubble of peace high above the chaos below. For Calvin Jones, known to the world as Big C, that moment arrived as he stepped onto the sleek private jet, its silver wings glinting like a promise of escape. This wasn't about fame or flash, it was about sanctuary. After months of grinding through tours, studio sessions, and the relentless glare of flashing cameras, he craved the quiet of the Maldives, its powdery white sands and turquoise waters calling him like a siren's song. He'd pictured it, the warm breeze, the endless horizon, a chance to breathe. But he couldn't have known that beneath the tranquil hum of those engines, a storm of venomous contempt was brewing, ready to shred his dream with words sharper than knives and eyes that burned with disgust. Calvin wasn't the type to flaunt. He stood tall, broad-shouldered but slightly stooped from years hunched over mixing boards and lyric sheets. His skin was a deep, sun-weathered brown, etched with the miles he'd traveled, and his dark brown eyes carried a quiet warmth, shadowed by the weariness of a life always on the move. That day he wore a faded black t-shirt, its tiny local brand logo barely clinging to the fabric over his left chest. His jeans, worn thin and pale, hugged his long legs, fraying at the hems above a pair of scuffed white sneakers. Once pristine, now yellowed and scratched, too stubborn to be replaced. A black baseball cap sat low on his head, shielding his face from the light, and a pair of small, round sunglasses perched loosely on his nose, not for show but because he liked the way they softened the world's edges. Around his wrist dangled a thin silver bracelet, a gift from his mom back when he was just a kid with big dreams in a run-down neighborhood. Calvin Jones, Big C, wasn't a star draped in designer suits or dripping with diamonds. He was a simple man, real to his core, even with the world shouting his name. Stepping into the jet, he paused, struck by the sheer opulence of it all, a luxury he'd never fully adjusted to. The cabin gleamed like a five-star hotel, plush brown leather seats that cradled you like a lover, soft ambient lights glowing from sleek ceiling panels, and a faint scent of sandalwood mingling with rich leather in the air. He slung his battered canvas backpack, the only luggage he'd bothered with, stuffed with a few clothes and his tablet, onto the floor and sank into a seat. It was so soft he chuckled under his breath, muttering, "Man, I could sleep through the apocalypse in this thing." He stretched, joints popping faintly, and fished his earbuds from his pocket, ready to lose himself in a playlist of slow jazz and hip-hop, the kind of music that always steadied his soul. A flight attendant approached, her smile bright as morning sun. She wore a crisp navy uniform, her blonde hair tied back neatly, blue eyes sparkling with genuine kindness. "Hey, Mr. Jones," she said warmly, setting a glass of fresh orange juice on the small table beside him. "I'm Mia. Anything you need, just let me know, okay?" Calvin nodded, lifting the glass in a mock toast. "Thanks, Mia. Y'all really outdid yourselves with this setup." She giggled at his easy charm and slipped away, leaving him to settle into his slice of calm. The jet taxied down the runway, its engines humming a soothing tune. Calvin leaned back, tugging his cap lower, letting a mix of excitement and relief wash over him. Through the small window, he watched the tarmac blur past, then the sky unfurl as the plane lifted off. He loved this, the weightlessness, the sense of leaving everything behind. The cabin was quiet, the other 10 or so passengers lost in their own worlds. A middle-aged guy in a gray suit tapping at a laptop, a young woman with wireless earbuds glued to her phone. No one spared him a glance, and he liked it that way. Here he wasn't Big C, the rap icon with millions of fans. He was just Calvin, a regular dude chasing a break. He pulled out his tablet, fingers brushing the screen as a new song idea flickered to life. A slow, soulful beat about freedom and unshackled dreams. The engine's drone blended into the rhythm in his head, a strange music only he could hear. The cabin lights dimmed, signaling night, and he reclined his seat, closing his eyes to let the gentle motion lull him into a half-sleep. Then the intercom crackled, slicing through the peace. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain, Daniel Harris. We've cleared U.S. airspace and are cruising at 35,000 feet. Weather's clear and we'll reach the Maldives in about 8 hours. Thank you for flying with us." Harris's voice was deep, clipped, professional. Calvin nodded to himself, satisfied, and drifted back toward his thoughts of sandy beaches. But the calm shattered when the cockpit door swung open. Daniel Harris stepped out, a towering figure with neatly combed light brown hair and a navy uniform stretched tight over a solid frame. His pale face was sharp, almost too perfect, but his green eyes, hidden briefly behind aviator shades, cut through the dim light like shards of ice. He strode down the aisle, nodding curtly at a few passengers with a thin, forced smile, a perfunctory gesture. Then he reached Calvin's row and his steps faltered, stopping dead. Those green eyes locked onto him, raking over every inch, his beat-up cap, faded shirt, tattered jeans and filthy sneakers. That gaze wasn't just scrutiny, it was raw, unfiltered contempt, a look so vile it seemed to drip with acid, burning holes through Calvin's very existence. Calvin slid his sunglasses off, meeting Harris's stare with a small, easy smile. "Flight going smooth, Captain?" he asked, his voice low and friendly the way he always talked to folks. Harris didn't answer. His lips pressed into a tight, venomous line, and his eyes narrowed into slits, glaring down at Calvin like he was a cockroach scuttling across a pristine floor. "Enjoying the flight, sir?" Harris finally spat out, the word "sir" twisted into a sneer, dripping with mockery so thick it stung. He tilted his head, arms crossing hard enough to make his knuckles blanch, and his gaze scorched over Calvin again, lingering on the frayed hems, the scuffed shoes, the cheap bracelet, like he was cataloging every flaw to fuel his disgust. "Yeah, for sure," Calvin replied, keeping his tone steady despite the prickling unease in his chest. "Y'all are running a tight ship. Appreciate it." He gave a little nod, hoping his sincerity might cut through whatever this was. But Harris didn't budge. He leaned in close, too close, his face hovering inches from Calvin's, his breath sour with stale coffee and spite. "Appreciate it?" Harris hissed, his voice a low, guttural snarl, each word laced with loathing. "A filthy punk like you doesn't appreciate anything." His eyes flared, wild and hateful, lips curling into a smirk so cruel it could have drawn blood. "Look at you, ragged, stinking like some street rat crawled out of the gutter." Calvin froze, his hand gripping the armrest, nails digging into the leather. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, voice dropping, the friendliness gone. Harris straightened, jutting his chin out, his stare slicing downward like a guillotine. "It means," he growled, words slithering through clenched teeth, "a piece of trash like you, dressed like a damn hobo, looking like you don't belong within a mile of this plane, has no business being here. Who the hell are you and what gives you the nerve to stink up my jet?" His voice trembled with rage, eyes blazing with a hatred so primal it seemed personal, as if Calvin's mere presence was an insult to his entire world. The cabin went dead silent, a suffocating hush. Calvin's pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to stay calm, rubbing the silver bracelet on his wrist, a lifeline to his composure. "I'm Calvin Jones, Big C," he said, voice firm, meeting that vicious stare head-on. "I booked this flight fair and square. Papers are all good. What's the problem?" Harris barked a laugh, a harsh, guttural sound that scraped the air. "Big C?" he mocked, dragging the name out like it was a sick joke, his lips twisting into a sneer so vicious it bared his teeth. "You think I'm some idiot who'd buy that? A lowlife like you, sitting here in my cabin with that garbage you call clothes?" He stepped closer, looming over Calvin, his shadow swallowing the light. "You're nothing but a dirty fraud, a disgusting little nobody pretending he's somebody. I don't believe a damn word out of your mouth, you piece of filth." His voice dropped to a venomous whisper, every syllable a dagger, his eyes glittering with sadistic glee as he leaned in, daring Calvin to snap. Calvin's breath hitched, his fist clenching so hard the leather creaked under his grip. He'd faced hate before, but this was a beast unleashed, a hatred so naked and brutal it clawed at his soul. "Check the papers," he said, slow and sharp, each word a shield against the onslaught. "Everything's legit. No need to turn this into something it ain't." But Harris's smirk widened, a predator savoring its prey. "Oh, I'll check," he murmured, voice dripping with malice, eyes locked on Calvin like he was plotting his destruction. Then he spun on his heel, stalking back to the cockpit, leaving Calvin drowning in a tide of humiliation and rage. He slid his sunglasses back on, yanked his cap down, but the venom lingered, a dark omen of the hell yet to come. The cabin of the private jet hummed with a deceptive calm, its plush leather seats and dimmed lights cloaking the tension that simmered beneath the surface. Calvin Jones, Big C, sat rigid, his faded black t-shirt clinging to his sweat-dampened back, the silver bracelet on his wrist glinting faintly as his fingers twitched against the armrest. His baseball cap shadowed his dark brown eyes, but they burned with a quiet fury, replaying the venomous encounter with Captain Daniel Harris. That bastard's words, "filthy punk, piece of trash, disgusting little nobody," echoed in his skull like a looped track, each syllable a fresh cut to his pride. He'd dealt with hate before, but this was different, raw, personal, a predator's glee in every sneered syllable. The Maldives, his promised paradise, felt a million miles away now, replaced by a gnawing dread that coiled tighter with every passing minute. Calvin adjusted his sunglasses, sliding them back onto his nose, trying to bury the anger beneath the familiar rhythm of his playlist. He tapped his scuffed sneaker against the floor, sinking it to a slow beat only he could hear, desperate to drown out the venom still stinging his ears. The other passengers, a suited businessman, a headphone-clad woman, kept their eyes averted, their silence a wall of indifference. Mia, the blonde flight attendant, flitted through the cabin, her warm smile faltering whenever she glanced his way, as if she sensed the storm brewing but didn't dare step into it. Calvin exhaled hard through his nose, forcing his shoulders to relax. Let it go, man, he told himself. This ain't worth your peace. But deep down he knew Harris wasn't done. Those green eyes had promised more than just words. The intercom crackled again, slicing through the cabin's hush like a gunshot. Ladies and gentlemen, Harris's voice rasped, sharper now, stripped of its earlier polish, we're cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet. Weather's clear. Sit tight. The words were routine, but the edge in his tone, a jagged, barely restrained hostility, sent a shiver down Calvin's spine. He shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under his weight, and glanced toward the cockpit door. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, a primal instinct honed from years navigating hostile streets and backstabbing industry sharks. His hand brushed the tablet on his lap, fingers itching to write, to turn this bullshit into lyrics, but the muse wouldn't come, not with that bastard shadow still looming. Minutes dragged by, the cabin's serenity a fragile lie. Calvin closed his eyes, letting the hum of the engines pull him into a shallow calm, when the cockpit door banged open with a force that rattled the walls. Harris stormed out, his navy uniform taut over his broad frame, his light brown hair slightly askew, as if he'd been pacing like a caged animal. His green eyes locked onto Calvin instantly, blazing with a hatred so fierce it seemed to suck the air from the room. The other passengers flinched, heads turning, but Harris didn't spare them a glance. He marched down the aisle, boots thudding against the carpet, each step a declaration of war. Calvin straightened, sunglasses slipping down his nose, his pulse kicking into overdrive. Here we go. Harris stopped inches from Calvin's seat, towering over him like a vulture over carrion. His lips curled into a sneer, baring teeth that gleamed under the dim lights. You, he spat, voice low and guttural, dripping with disgust. Calvin fucking Jones, huh? Still sitting here like you own the damn place. His eyes raked over Calvin's faded shirt, his tattered jeans, his beat-up sneakers, and the contempt in that gaze was a physical thing, sharp, searing, a blade pressed to Calvin's throat. I told you, you piece of shit, you don't belong here. Calvin's jaw tightened, his fists clenching until his knuckles ached. I already said, he replied, voice steady but laced with steel, I booked this flight. Papers are good. You got a problem, take it up with the charter folks. He met Harris's stare, refusing to blink, his dark eyes a wall against the onslaught. But Harris didn't back off. He leaned in closer, so close Calvin could smell the sour tang of coffee on his breath, and his voice dropped to a venomous hiss. Papers? I don't give a fuck about your papers, you dirty little cunt. You think some scribbled bullshit makes you one of us? You're a goddamn stain on this plane. The words hit like a punch, raw and unfiltered, but Calvin held his ground, his chest rising and falling faster now. Back off, man, he warned low and firm. I ain't here for your drama. Harris barked a laugh, a harsh, jagged sound that scraped the air, and straightened up, his sneer widening into something feral. Drama? Oh, you ain't seen drama yet, you fucking lowlife. He jabbed a finger into Calvin's chest, hard enough to shove him back into the seat, the leather squeaking under the force. I know your type. Thugs, scum, thinking you can buy your way into places you don't deserve. Not on my fucking watch. Calvin's blood boiled, his hand shooting up to swat Harris's finger away, but before he could, Harris stumbled, deliberately it seemed, and his boot hooked around Calvin's ankle. With a vicious yank, he tripped Calvin, sending him sprawling half out of the seat, his tablet clattering to the floor. The cabin gasped, a collective intake of breath, but no one moved. Calvin caught himself on the armrest, his cap tumbling off, rage flaring white-hot in his chest. What the fuck, man? He snapped, scrambling to his feet, towering over Harris now despite the humiliation burning his face. Harris smirked, unfazed, and grabbed a steaming mug of coffee from Mia's tray as she hovered nearby, her blue eyes wide with panic. You wanna play tough, huh? He snarled, and without warning he flung the scalding liquid straight into Calvin's face. The coffee hit like a slap, hot and bitter, soaking his shirt and dripping down his chin. Calvin staggered back, a roar of pain and fury tearing from his throat as he wiped his eyes, the sting blurring his vision. "You motherfucker!" he bellowed, lunging forward, but Harris danced back, laughing, a sick, triumphant cackle that echoed through the cabin. "Stay down, you piece of trash!" Harris roared, his voice a thunderclap, green eyes wild with sadistic glee. "You think you can touch me? You're nothing, just a fucking rat in a cage." He lunged again, shoving Calvin hard in the chest, sending him crashing back into the seat. The other passengers stared, frozen, their faces a mix of shock and fear, while Mia stammered, "Captain, please, stop." Her voice trembled, but Harris whirled on her, snarling, "Shut your damn mouth, Mia, or you're next." She shrank back, clutching her tray, tears welling in her eyes. Calvin wiped the coffee from his face, his hands trembling with barely restrained rage. His shirt clung to his skin, the heat still searing, but the humiliation cut deeper than the burns. "You're a fucking lunatic," he growled, standing again, his 6-foot frame looming despite the dripping mess he'd become. "I paid for this seat same as everyone else. You don't get to treat me like this." His voice shook, not with fear, but with a fury he hadn't felt since the streets, a primal, survivalist fire. Harris stepped closer, his boots inches from Calvin's sneakers, his sneer twisting into something demonic. "Paid for it?" he mocked, spitting the words like poison. "You think your dirty money means shit to me? You're a goddamn parasite, Jones, a thieving, stinking parasite. I oughta throw you out the fucking hatch right now." He grabbed Calvin's collar, yanking him forward, his knuckles white against the faded fabric. "You don't belong here, you hear me? You're a fucking disgrace to this plane, to me, to every decent person on it." Calvin's hands shot up, gripping Harris's wrists, twisting hard to break free. "Get your damn hands off me," he roared, shoving Harris back with a force that sent the captain stumbling into the aisle. Harris caught himself on a seat, his face contorting with rage, and he charged again, fist raised. "You little bitch," he screamed, swinging wildly, but Calvin ducked, the punch grazing his shoulder. The cabin erupted in chaos, passengers shouting, Mia crying out, "Stop it, please." But Harris was a man possessed, his eyes bloodshot, his curses a torrent of filth. "I'll fucking end you, you piece of shit. You're dead." Calvin sidestepped another blow, his heart hammering, adrenaline flooding his veins. "I ain't fighting you, man," he said through gritted teeth, hands up but not striking back. "You're the one losing it. Back the fuck off." But Harris wouldn't stop. He grabbed Calvin's arm, wrenching it hard, and kicked at his legs again, trying to bring him down. "You don't tell me what to do, you fucking scum," he bellowed, spit flying from his mouth, his face red and twisted with hate. Mia darted forward, her tray clattering to the floor, and grabbed Harris's arm. "Captain, enough," she shrieked, her voice breaking. Harris whirled, backhanding her across the cheek with a sickening crack. She stumbled, clutching her face, and Calvin's restraint snapped. "You son of a bitch," he yelled, shoving Harris hard into the wall, pinning him there with a forearm to his chest. "You don't hit her, you hear me? You don't fucking touch her." Harris thrashed, snarling like a rabid dog, but Calvin held firm, his strength fueled by a rage he couldn't leash anymore. "You're done, man," he growled, his voice low and lethal, coffee still dripping from his chin. "You're fucking done." The passengers were on their feet now, some shouting, others filming with shaky hands, but no one dared step closer. Mia sobbed quietly, blood trickling from her lip, and Harris's eyes, those hateful green slits, glared up at Calvin with unhinged fury. "You'll pay for this, you bastard," he hissed, his voice a ragged promise. "I'll make sure you rot." The intercom buzzed again, a flight officer's voice cutting through the chaos. "Captain Harris, return to the cockpit immediately. We've got a situation." Harris froze, his chest heaving, then shoved Calvin off with a final vicious push. "This ain't over, you piece of shit," he spat, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He straightened his uniform, shot Mia a glare that made her flinch, and stormed back to the cockpit, slamming the door behind him. Calvin sank into his seat, his soaked shirt cold against his skin, his hands shaking with adrenaline and anger. Mia knelt beside him, her trembling fingers clutching a napkin. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, dabbing at his face, her cheek already bruising. "He's never—" "I didn't think—" Calvin shook his head, his voice hoarse. "Ain't your fault, Mia. That asshole's unhinged." He took the napkin, wiping the last of the coffee from his eyes, the burn still throbbing but nothing compared to the fire in his gut. The cabin settled into an uneasy hush, passengers whispering, stealing glances. Calvin pulled his cap back on, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He'd come here for peace, for escape, but Harris had turned it into a battlefield. Every curse, every shove, every drop of that scalding coffee had stripped away his calm, leaving only a simmering resolve. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He'd make that bastard pay not just for himself, but for every ounce of hate he'd spewed. The Maldives could wait. Right now, Calvin Jones was at war. The private jet sliced through the night sky at 35,000 feet, its engines purring a deceptive lullaby over the chaos that had erupted within its sleek walls. Calvin Jones, Big C, sat slumped in his soaked seat, the bitter sting of coffee still clinging to his faded black t-shirt, his scuffed sneakers planted firm against the floor. His baseball cap lay crumpled beside him, knocked off in the fray, and his dark brown eyes blazed beneath the damp fringe of his hair, eyes that had seen too much hate in one lifetime, now locked on the cockpit door where Daniel Harris had retreated. The captain's curses, "Fucking lowlife, piece of shit," still rang in his ears, each word a fresh lash across his pride, while the scalding splash of coffee burned deeper than his skin. His hands, trembling with barely contained fury, gripped the armrests, the silver bracelet on his wrist glinting like a silent vow. This wasn't over. Not by a damn sight. The cabin buzzed with a fragile unease, passengers whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting between Calvin and the cockpit like spectators at a cage fight. Mia knelt beside him, her blonde hair spilling loose from its neat bun, her cheeks swelling where Harris's backhand had landed. She dabbed at Calvin's face with a napkin, her fingers shaking, her blue eyes wet with guilt and fear. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Jones," she murmured, voice cracking. "He's never gone this far." "I didn't know." Calvin shook his head, brushing her hand away gently, his voice rough as gravel. "Stop that, Mia. Ain't your fault. That bastard's a fucking animal." He wiped his chin, the coffee's heat fading but the humiliation searing hotter with every breath. He straightened, tugging his cap back on, the damp fabric of his shirt sticking to his broad shoulders. His jaw clenched tight, a muscle ticking beneath the skin as he replayed the madness, Harris tripping him, hurling coffee in his face, swinging fists like a rabid dog. Calvin had held back, kept his fists down, but the leash on his temper was fraying fast. He'd come here for peace, for the Maldives' white sands and quiet waves, not this war zone in the sky. But Harris had made it personal, and Calvin wasn't the type to let that slide, not anymore. The intercom crackled again, a sound that now felt like a gunshot in the tense air. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harris's voice slithered through, low and jagged, stripped of any pretense of calm, "this is your captain. We've hit a minor issue. Stay seated. We'll handle it." The words were clipped, but the venom beneath them coiled tight, a snake ready to strike. Calvin's gut twisted. "Minor issue, my ass," he thought, glancing at Mia, who'd gone pale, her hands clutching the napkin like a lifeline. "What's he up to now?" Calvin muttered, his voice barely audible, but the dread in it was loud as thunder. Minutes ticked by, each one a slow drip of acid on his nerves. The cabin lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the plush interior, and the passengers shifted uncomfortably, their whispers growing sharper. Calvin tapped his foot, the rhythm a lifeline to his sanity, when the cockpit door slammed open again with a bang that jolted everyone upright. Harris emerged, his navy uniform disheveled, tie askew, light brown hair matted with sweat. His green eyes, wild, bloodshot, unhinged, zeroed in on Calvin like a predator spotting prey. He clutched a clipboard in one hand, knuckles white, and his lips twisted into a snarl that bared his teeth, a feral beast unleashed. "You!" Harris roared, storming down the aisle, his boots pounding the carpet like war drums. "Calvin fucking Jones, you goddamn parasite." His voice was a guttural bellow raw with hate, and he flung the clipboard at Calvin's chest with a vicious snap of his wrist. It hit hard, the edge digging into Calvin's ribs, and he grunted, catching it before it fell. "What the hell's your problem now?" Calvin shot back, standing fast, his 6-foot frame towering as he tossed the clipboard aside. His voice trembled with rage, but he kept his fists at his sides, for now. Harris stopped inches away, his face red and contorted, spit flying as he screamed, "My problem? You're my fucking problem, you stinking piece of shit. I checked your papers, bullshit scribbles from some two-bit agency. You think that makes you legit? You're a fraud, a fucking nobody." He jabbed a finger into Calvin's chest, harder this time, shoving him back a step. "You don't belong here, you hear me? You're a goddamn infection, and I'm cutting you out." Calvin swatted Harris's hand away, his patience snapping like a brittle twig. "Back the fuck off, man," he snarled, stepping forward, closing the gap until their breaths clashed. "I paid for this flight, same as these folks. You don't get to decide who belongs, you racist prick. His dark eyes locked with Harris's, a storm meeting a wildfire, and the air between them crackled with violence waiting to erupt. Harris laughed, a harsh, maniacal sound that grated like nails on glass. Racist? Oh, you're pulling that card, you whining little bitch? He lunged, grabbing Calvin's collar with both hands, yanking him forward so hard their foreheads nearly collided. I don't give a fuck what you paid, you filthy thug. You're trash, pure, stinking trash, and I'm not letting you pollute my plane. His voice rose to a shriek, his grip tightening, veins bulging in his neck as he shook Calvin like a rag doll. Calvin's hands shot up, seizing Harris's wrists, twisting with a force born of years surviving tougher streets than this bastard could imagine. Get your fucking hands off me, he roared, shoving Harris back with a power that sent the captain crashing into a seat. Harris stumbled, catching himself, and his eyes flared with a madness that chilled the room. You dare touch me, you son of a bitch? He screamed, charging again, fist cocked. Calvin ducked, the punch whistling past his ear, and Harris's momentum carried him into the aisle, where he spun, wild-eyed, spitting curses. I'll fucking kill you, you piece of shit. You're dead. The passengers gasped, some scrambling back, others frozen in their seats, phones trembling in their hands as they filmed. Mia darted forward, her voice a desperate cry, Captain, stop it. Please. But Harris whirled on her, his arms swinging wide, and she ducked just in time, the blow grazing her hair. Shut your fucking trap, Mia, he bellowed, his face a mask of rage. This ain't your business, you stupid cow. She staggered back, tears streaming, and Calvin's blood turned to fire. Don't you fucking touch her, he roared, lunging at Harris, slamming him against the cabin wall with a thud that shook the frame. His forearm pressed into Harris's throat, pinning him, his coffee-stained shirt stretching tight over his heaving chest. You're a goddamn lunatic, you hear me? You don't hit her, you don't hit anyone. His voice was a growl, low and lethal, every word a promise of retribution. Harris thrashed, clawing at Calvin's arm, his boots kicking wildly, but Calvin held firm, his strength a wall of fury. Let me go, you fucking animal. Harris choked out, his voice ragged, his green eyes bulging with hate. You think you can win this? I'm the captain, I own this plane, and you're nothing but a dead man walking. He spat in Calvin's face, a wet glob hitting his cheek, and Calvin flinched, his grip tightening until Harris wheezed, his face purpling. You're done, asshole, Calvin hissed, spit dripping down his jaw. You're fucking done. The intercom buzzed, cutting through the chaos like a blade. Captain Harris, return to the cockpit now, a co-pilot's voice barked, sharp with urgency. Harris froze, his chest heaving, then shoved Calvin off with a final desperate push, gasping for air. This ain't over, you bastard, he rasped, wiping his mouth, his eyes glinting with a promise of vengeance. He straightened his tie, shot Mia a glare that made her shrink, and stormed back to the cockpit, the door slamming shut with a clang that echoed like a gunshot. Calvin stumbled back, wiping the spit from his face, his hands shaking with adrenaline and disgust. His shirt hung wet and cold, his ribs throbbing where the clipboard had struck, but the pain was nothing next to the inferno in his gut. Mia rushed to his side, her voice trembling. Are you okay? Oh God, I'm so sorry. Calvin waved her off, his breath ragged. I'm fine, Mia. Check yourself, he hit you hard. She touched her cheek, wincing, blood smearing her fingers, and Calvin's fists clenched again, the urge to storm the cockpit nearly overwhelming. The cabin settled into a stunned silence, passengers whispering, some filming still, their faces pale with shock. Calvin sank into his seat, his cap back on, pulled low over his eyes. His heart pounded, a war drum in his chest, and he replayed every second, Harris's fists, his spit, his unhinged rage. This wasn't just hate, it was a vendetta, a sickness Calvin couldn't fathom. He'd wanted peace, a break from the grind, but Harris had turned this jet into a battlefield, and Calvin was caught in the crosshairs. Then the intercom crackled once more, Harris's voice slicing through, colder now, deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen, due to a safety concern, the words dripped with mockery, we're making an unscheduled landing at the nearest strip. Remain seated. A murmur rippled through the cabin, confusion and fear tightening the air. Calvin's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. Safety concern? Bullshit. This was about him, Harris's next move in this twisted game. The plane tilted, descending fast, the cabin lights flickering again as the engines whined. Calvin gripped his armrests, his mind racing. He glanced at Mia, who'd gone white, her hands clasped tight. What's he doing? she whispered, terror in her eyes. I don't know, Calvin muttered, his voice grim, but it ain't good. The descent steepened, the jet shuddering, and passengers clutched their seats, some muttering prayers, others staring at Calvin like he'd brought this down on them all. The cockpit door banged open again and Harris strode out, his uniform rumpled, his face a mask of cold fury. He marched straight for Calvin, his boots pounding a death knell, and stopped inches away, his green eyes glinting with a chilling resolve. You, he snarled, voice low and deadly, get your fucking shit and stand up. You're getting off this plane, now. His hand shot out, grabbing Calvin's backpack and hurling it into the aisle, the zipper splitting, clothes spilling out like guts. Calvin stood slow, his frame towering, his voice a growl. I ain't going nowhere, man. I paid for this flight, you don't get to kick me off. Harris stepped closer, his breath hot and sour, his sneer twisting. Paid? You think your dirty cash means shit? You're a fucking danger, Jones, a goddamn threat to everyone here. Get up or I'll drag you out myself. He shoved Calvin hard, hands slamming into his chest, but Calvin held his ground, his dark eyes blazing. You're the danger, you psycho, Calvin shot back, shoving Harris off, the force sending the captain staggering. You're losing it, look at you. Harris lunged again, grabbing Calvin's arm, twisting it behind his back with a savage yank. Move, you bastard, he screamed, dragging Calvin toward the exit as the plane leveled out, tires screeching against the tarmac somewhere in the dark unknown. Passengers shouted, Mia sobbing, Captain, no! But Harris ignored them, his grip iron as he hauled Calvin to the door. The jet lurched to a stop, and Harris kicked the hatch open, humid jungle air flooding in, thick and oppressive. He shoved Calvin hard, sending him stumbling onto the tarmac, his backpack flung after him, landing in a heap. Out, you piece of shit! Harris bellowed, his voice echoing into the night. Stay the fuck out of my sky. Calvin caught himself, spinning to face Harris, his fists clenched, rage boiling over. This ain't over, you motherfucker, he yelled, his voice raw, cutting through the roar of the engines as Harris slammed the door shut. The jet's engines revved, and within seconds it was rolling, lifting off, leaving Calvin alone on a deserted airstrip, surrounded by dense, whispering jungle. He stood there, chest heaving, the humid air clinging to his soaked shirt, his eyes locked on the disappearing plane. Harris had won this round, but Calvin wasn't done. Not by a long shot. This was war now and he'd fight it to the end. The private jet roared back into the sky, its silver wings slicing through the humid night, leaving Calvin Jones, Big C, stranded on the desolate tarmac of an unknown airstrip. His faded black t-shirt clung to his sweat-soaked skin, coffee stains streaking the fabric like war paint, his scuffed sneakers crunching against gravel as he stood, chest heaving, staring at the vanishing tail lights. His baseball cap lay crumpled in the dirt beside his torn backpack, its contents, clothes, his tablet, spilled out like a gutted animal. His dark brown eyes burned with a fury that could have ignited the jungle around him, the silver bracelet on his wrist glinting faintly as his fists clenched tight. Daniel Harris had thrown him off like trash, but the echoes of the captain's venom, fucking parasite, stinking piece of shit, still lashed at his soul, each word a fresh wound. He'd wanted peace, a retreat to the Maldives, but now he was alone, abandoned in a sweltering nowhere, with nothing but rage and the distant hum of wildlife. The airstrip stretched into darkness, a thin scar of concrete swallowed by dense, whispering jungle on all sides. A rusted shed loomed nearby, its door hanging loose on creaking hinges, offering no shelter, no answers. Calvin wiped the sweat from his brow, his jaw tight, replaying the chaos, Harris's fists, the scalding coffee, the brutal shove that sent him sprawling. He'd held back, kept his hands down, but that restraint was a fraying thread now, snapping with every breath. You motherfucker, he muttered, voice low and raw, kicking a rock into the undergrowth. This ain't over. He bent to gather his scattered belongings, stuffing them into the ripped backpack, his mind racing. He'd find a way out, a way back, and Harris would pay. Oh, he'd fucking pay. The jet's engines faded into the night, leaving an oppressive silence broken only by the rustle of leaves and the chirp of unseen creatures. Calvin slung the backpack over his shoulder, his ribs throbbing where Harris's clipboard had struck, and started toward the shed, hoping for a radio, a phone, anything. But before he'd taken 10 steps, a deafening roar split the air, the jet circling back, its lights blazing like twin suns in the black sky. Calvin froze, his pulse spiking, dread clawing up his spine. What the hell? He whispered, squinting as the plane descended fast, impossibly fast, its wheels screaming against the tarmac as it landed again, kicking up dust and gravel in a violent storm. The hatch slammed open and Harris leapt out, his navy uniform stained with sweat, his light brown hair wild, his green eyes glinting with a madness that turned Calvin's blood cold. 2 crew members, burly, stone-faced men in matching uniforms, flanked him, their hands flexing like they were itching for a fight. Harris marched forward, boots pounding, his snarl twisting into something demonic. "Thought you could just walk away, you fucking rat?" he bellowed, voice a thunderclap that echoed through the jungle. "You don't get off that easy, Jones." Calvin dropped his backpack, planting his feet, his fists rising instinctively. "What's your damn problem now, Harris?" he roared back, his voice raw with defiance. "You already dumped me, ain't that enough for your sick ass?" But Harris didn't slow, closing the gap in seconds, his eyes blazing with unhinged fury. "Enough?" he spat, spit flying from his mouth. "You're a fucking blight, you piece of shit, a goddamn disease I'm gonna rip out with my bare hands." He lunged, faster than Calvin expected, and slammed a fist into his jaw, the crack of knuckles on bone ringing out like a gunshot. Calvin staggered, pain exploding across his face, blood flooding his mouth as he tasted iron. "You bastard," he growled, swinging back, his fist grazing Harris's cheek, but the crewman pounced, grabbing his arms with iron grips. "Hold him, you fuckers." Harris screamed, and they twisted Calvin's wrists behind his back, forcing him to his knees. He thrashed, muscles straining, but they were too strong, their hands like vices. Harris loomed over him, panting, his sneer a mask of triumph. "You think you're tough, huh, you filthy thug?" he hissed, grabbing a coil of rope from one of the crewmen. "Let's see how tough you are when I'm done with you." Calvin's heart pounded, adrenaline surging as Harris yanked his arms tighter, looping the rope around his wrists and cinching it hard, the coarse fibers biting into his skin. "Get off me, you psycho!" Calvin yelled, kicking out, his sneaker slamming into Harris's shin. Harris grunted, his face twisting with rage, and drove a knee into Calvin's gut, knocking the air from his lungs. "Shut your fucking mouth," he roared, then grabbed Calvin's hair, yanking his head back to spit in his face, a wet, degrading glob that dripped down his cheek. Calvin gagged, fury boiling over, but the ropes held him fast, his shoulders screaming in their sockets. Harris stepped back, wiping his hands on his pants like he'd touched something diseased, his green eyes glinting with sadistic glee. "Load him up," he barked at the crewman who hauled Calvin to his feet, dragging him toward the jet despite his thrashing. "You're not dumping me again, you son of a bitch." Calvin snarled, twisting against their grip, but they shoved him up the steps, his sneakers slipping on the metal, and threw him into the cabin. He hit the floor hard, his tied hands useless, his cheek scraping the carpet as passengers gasped, their faces pale with terror. Mia rushed forward, her bruised cheek stark against her tear-streaked face, her voice a desperate cry. "Captain, stop this." "You can't," Harris whirled, backhanding her again, sending her sprawling with a yelp. "Keep your fucking nose out of it, Mia," he screamed, his voice unhinged, spit flying. Calvin roared, "Leave her alone, you coward," and lunged, ramming his shoulder into Harris's side despite the ropes, knocking him against a seat. Harris cursed, spinning, and drove a fist into Calvin's face. Once, twice, 3 times, each blow a sledgehammer, splitting his lip, bruising his eye, blood streaming down his chin. "You're dead, you hear me?" Harris panted, his knuckles red, his face a mask of rage as he grabbed Calvin by the collar, dragging him toward the open hatch. The jet taxied fast, engines roaring, the cabin tilting as it lifted off again, climbing steep into the night. Calvin's head spun, pain throbbing, blood dripping onto the floor, but he fought, kicking wildly, his tied hands clawing at nothing. "What the fuck are you doing?" he yelled, voice hoarse, panic clawing up his throat as the humid wind howled through the open door. Harris grinned, a sick, twisted smile, and leaned close, his breath hot and sour. "I told you you don't belong in my sky, you fucking maggot. Time to take out the trash." He nodded to the crewman who seized Calvin's arms, hauling him to the hatch's edge. The ocean gleamed below, a vast black abyss under the moonlight, miles from shore, its waves a distant shimmer of death. Calvin's eyes widened, his heart slamming against his ribs. "No, don't you fucking dare," he screamed, thrashing harder, his sneakers skidding against the floor, but the crewman's grip was steel. "Say goodbye, you piece of shit," Harris snarled, and with a savage shove he pushed Calvin out. The world tilted, air rushing past in a deafening roar as Calvin plummeted, his tied hands flailing, his body twisting in free fall. The jet's lights vanished above, swallowed by the night, and he hit the water like a cannonball, the impact a brutal punch that drove the breath from his lungs. Cold salt water flooded his mouth, his nose, dragging him under, the ropes binding his wrists, pulling him down like anchors into the dark. Calvin thrashed, legs kicking, lungs burning as he fought the ocean's grip. His swollen eye pulsed, blood clouding the water around him, but he refused to sink, refused to let Harris win. He twisted, tugging at the ropes, the coarse fibers shredding his skin, until one wrist slipped free, then the other, the pain a distant scream against his will to live. He clawed upward, breaking the surface with a gasping roar, coughing blood and brine, his soaked shirt heavy as lead. The jet was gone, a faint speck in the sky, leaving him alone in the endless sea, waves crashing over his head, the jungle airstrip a memory swallowed by the horizon. He treaded water, his arms aching, his face a mask of bruises and cuts, the salt stinging every wound. The moonlight painted the ocean silver, a cruel beauty that mocked his plight, and he cursed Harris with every ragged breath. "You motherfucker," he spat, voice lost to the wind, his fists punching the waves. "I'm coming for you." He didn't know how long he could last, minutes, hours, but despair wasn't an option. He'd survived worse than this, clawed his way up from nothing, and he'd be damned if some racist psycho ended him here. Hours bled into eternity, the cold seeping into his bones, his strength fading with every stroke. His swollen eye blurred, his split lip throbbed, but he swam, driven by a fire Harris couldn't extinguish. Then a faint light flickered on the horizon. A boat, its hull cutting through the waves, its engine a distant growl. Calvin's heart leapt, a surge of hope igniting his battered body. He waved his free arm, shouting hoarsely, "Hey! Over here!" The boat turned, its spotlight sweeping the water, and voices called out, sharp with urgency. Rough hands hauled him aboard, his soaked frame collapsing onto the deck, water pooling beneath him. Faces loomed, fishermen, their skin weathered, their eyes wide with shock. "Holy shit, man, you okay?" one asked, his voice thick with an accent Calvin couldn't place. "Who are you?" Calvin coughed, spitting blood, his voice a rasp. "Calvin Jones. Big C. Got thrown out a damn plane by a psycho pilot." The men exchanged stunned glances, their jaws dropping, and the oldest, a grizzled man with a gray beard, clapped a hand on his shoulder, firm but kind. "You're safe now, brother. We'll get you to shore." They wrapped him in a blanket, the coarse fabric rough against his bruised skin, and handed him a bottle of water he drank in gulps, washing the salt from his throat. The boat rocked, cutting through the waves toward a distant coastline, its lights a faint promise of salvation. Calvin leaned back, his head pounding, his body screaming, but his mind was clear, sharper than ever. Harris thought he'd killed him, thought he'd won. But Calvin was alive, and that bastard's reckoning was coming. As dawn broke, painting the sky gold, the boat docked at a small fishing village, its wooden huts clustered along a sandy shore. The fishermen helped him off, their voices a chorus of awe and outrage as they pieced together his story. "That pilot's a dead man," the gray-bearded man growled, his fist clenched. "You're Big C. My kids love your music. We're getting you home, man." They patched his cuts, fed him bread and fish, and rigged a satellite phone to call for help, their kindness a lifeline Calvin clung to. He sat on the shore, the blanket around his shoulders, his swollen face caked with dried blood, staring at the ocean that nearly claimed him. His hands shook, not from cold but from a resolve forged in pain. Harris had tried to break him, tied him, beat him, dropped him to die, but he'd failed. Calvin Jones wasn't just a survivor. He was a fighter, and this fight was far from over. He'd get back to the States, tell the world, and bury that bastard in the hell he deserved. The Maldives could wait. Right now it was war, and Calvin was ready to win. The fishing boat rocked gently on the dawnlit waves, its weathered hull cutting a slow path toward a distant shore, a faint smear of green and gold against the endless blue. Calvin Jones, Big C, lay sprawled on the deck, his soaked black t-shirt clinging to his bruised torso like a second skin, his scuffed sneakers dripping seawater into a puddle beneath him. The silver bracelet on his wrist glinted faintly, a lone spark of light against the dark tapestry of his battered body, split lip crusted with blood, swollen eye half shut, cuts and bruises mapping his face like a war-torn canvas. His baseball cap was gone, lost to the ocean that had nearly swallowed him, and his dark brown eyes stared blankly at the sky, flickering with a storm of rage, pain, and something deeper, something unbreakable. Daniel Harris had tied his hands, beaten him senseless, and dropped him into the abyss, but Calvin was alive. Alive and burning. The fishermen hovered around him, their voices a low hum of awe and concern, their rough hands steady as they draped a coarse blanket over his shoulders. The oldest, a grizzled man named Amos with a gray beard tangled like sea moss, knelt beside him, his weathered face etched with disbelief. "Jesus man, you're a damn miracle," he rasped, his voice thick with a coastal drawl. "Calvin Jones, Big C, my grandkids blast your tunes nonstop. What the hell happened to you?" Calvin coughed, a wet, ragged sound, spitting blood onto the deck as he propped himself up on one elbow. "Got thrown out a plane," he muttered, voice hoarse, raw from salt water and fury. "Racist bastard pilot, Daniel Harris, tried to kill me." The words hung heavy, a grenade lobbed into the quiet morning, and the fishermen froze, their jaws dropping, eyes widening in a mix of shock and outrage. Amos's fist clenched, his knuckles whitening against his dark skin. "That son of a bitch," he growled, his voice trembling with anger. "Tried to kill you? For what? 'Cause you're you?" Calvin nodded, wincing as pain lanced through his ribs, his swollen eye throbbing with every heartbeat. "Yeah," he said, spitting again, the taste of blood and brine bitter on his tongue. "Didn't like a filthy thug, like me on his precious jet. Tied me up, beat the shit out of me, dumped me in the ocean." His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from a fury so deep it clawed at his throat, begging to be unleashed. The youngest fisherman, a wiry kid named Javi, barely 20 with a mop of black curls, gaped, his hands trembling as he clutched a water bottle. "That's fucking insane, man," he stammered, shoving the bottle into Calvin's grip. "You're Big C, how's he get away with that?" Calvin took the bottle, gulping it down, the cold washing away the salt but not the fire in his gut. "He won't," he said, low and lethal, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, smearing blood across his bruised knuckles. "Not when I'm done with him." His eyes flicked to the horizon, narrowing as the shoreline grew closer, a lifeline he'd clawed his way toward through the dark. Inside his mind was a battlefield. Every wave that rocked the boat sent flashes of memory crashing over him. Harris's green eyes glinting with sadistic glee, the ropes biting into his wrists, the gut-wrenching plunge into the ocean. He'd felt the water close over his head, cold and suffocating, pulling him down like Harris's hate made liquid. He'd thrashed, lungs screaming, the ropes a death sentence, until they weren't. He'd fought free, broken the surface, survived. But survival wasn't enough. Not now. Not after this. His hands shook, not from the chill seeping into his bones, but from a rage that pulsed like a second heartbeat, a primal drumbeat demanding justice, demanding blood. Amos clapped a hand on his shoulder, firm but steady, grounding him. "You're safe now, brother," he said, voice rough but warm. "We'll get you patched up, get you home. That bastard's gonna pay, I swear it." Calvin nodded, forcing a tight smile, but his mind churned. Safe? Maybe for now. But home felt a million miles away, and the thought of Harris flying free, smirking in that cockpit, twisted his stomach into knots. He saw Mia's bruised face, her terrified eyes, and guilt gnawed at him. He'd tried to protect her, but he'd failed, dragged away before he could stop Harris's rampage. That failure stung worse than the cuts on his face, a wound no bandage could touch. The boat docked at a ramshackle fishing village, its wooden huts perched on stilts above a sandy shore, nets and ropes strewn like spiderwebs in the morning sun. The fisherman hauled Calvin to his feet, his legs wobbling, muscles screaming from hours in the water. Javi slung Calvin's arm over his shoulder, guiding him to a hut where a woman, Maria, Amos's wife, waited, her dark eyes sharp with concern. "Madre de Dios," she gasped, seeing his battered face, and rushed to gather bandages, water, and a plate of bread and fish. Calvin sank onto a wooden bench, the blanket slipping as Maria cleaned his cuts, her hands gentle but firm, her muttered prayers a soft rhythm against his ragged breaths. "You're lucky to be alive," she said, dabbing antiseptic on his split lip, her voice steady despite the tremble in her fingers. "God was watching you out there." Calvin winced, the sting sharp, but managed a hoarse chuckle. "Maybe," he rasped, "but I'm pretty sure the devil had his hands on me first." Maria's lips twitched, a faint smile breaking through, and she pressed a warm cloth to his swollen eye, easing the ache. "You've got fight in you, Big C," she said. "That's what kept you breathing." Fight. Yeah, he had that. Always had. Growing up in the projects, dodging fists and worse, clawing his way to the top with nothing but a beat and a dream, he'd fought every damn day. But this was different. Harris hadn't just attacked his body. He'd tried to erase him, to snuff out his existence like a candle in a storm. Calvin's mind spun, teetering between exhaustion and a restless, gnawing need to strike back. He saw Harris's sneer, heard his taunts, "You don't belong in my sky," and his fists clenched, nails digging into his palms until blood welled. He wasn't just angry, he was haunted, a man teetering on the edge of something dark, something he hadn't tapped since the streets. Javi burst in, breathless, clutching a satellite phone. Got a signal, he announced, thrusting it toward Calvin. Call whoever you need, cops, your people, anyone. Calvin took it, the weight of it grounding him, a lifeline to the world he'd been ripped from. His fingers hovered over the keys, trembling as faces flashed through his mind. Kevin, his manager, the one guy who'd always had his back. His mom, who'd kill him herself if she knew he'd nearly died. His fans, millions strong, who'd lose their minds over this. He dialed Kevin, the line crackling, each ring a heartbeat stretching into eternity. Cal? That you? Kevin's voice broke through, sharp with worry, and Calvin's throat tightened, relief crashing over him like a wave. Yeah, Kev, he croaked, leaning against the wall, the phone pressed hard to his ear. I'm alive, man. Barely. Kevin cursed, a string of expletives that would have made a sailor blush. Where the hell you at? We've been freaking out. Your jet landed in the Maldives without you and me as a mess, saying some psycho pilot snapped. Calvin swallowed, the words sticking like glass. Harris, he said, voice low, venomous. He beat me, tied me up, threw me into the damn ocean. I'm in some fishing village, don't even know where. Fishermen pulled me out. Kevin's silence was deafening, then a growl erupted. That motherfucker's dead, Cal. Dead. I'm getting the lawyers, the press, everyone, we're burying him. Calvin's lips twitched, a grim smile breaking through the pain. Good, he said, but I want to be the one to swing the shovel. Kevin barked a laugh, tight with fury. You got it, man. Sit tight, I'm tracking this call, sending a plane. You're coming home and we're taking this bastard down. Calvin hung up, handing the phone back to Javi, who stared at him like he was a ghost made flesh. You're really him, huh? Javi said, awe softening his voice. Big C, the legend. Calvin nodded, exhaustion dragging at him, but a spark flickered in his chest. Pride, defiance, a reminder of who he was. Yeah, he muttered, and I ain't done yet. Amos stepped in, his gray eyes fierce. Your family now, brother, he said, clapping Calvin's shoulder again. We've got your back, whatever you need. Maria pressed a plate of food into his hands, her gaze steady. Eat, she ordered. You'll need strength for what's coming. He ate slowly, the bread dry in his mouth, the fish a lifeline to his fading energy. Each bite fueled him, stoking the fire that Harris had lit, a fire that wouldn't die until that bastard was on his knees. His mind raced, plotting, imagining Harris's smug face when the world turned on him. Calvin saw the headlines, the lawsuits, the jail cell, but it wasn't enough. He wanted to look Harris in the eye, see the fear, make him feel the helplessness Calvin had felt plummeting into the sea. It was a dark thought, a street thought, and it scared him how natural it felt, how it coiled around his heart like an old friend. The village buzzed around him, fishermen gathering, their voices rising in anger as Amos recounted the story. That pilot's a monster, one growled, slamming a fist on a table. We'll spread the word, everyone'll know. Calvin watched, his swollen eye throbbing, a strange mix of gratitude and isolation washing over him. These people, strangers, had saved him, embraced him, but he felt apart, a man caught between worlds. The ocean had stripped him bare, left him raw, and now he wrestled with what remained. A survivor, yes, but one teetering on vengeance's edge. Hours later, a helicopter's roar shattered the quiet, its blades chopping the air as it descended onto the beach, kicking up sand in a golden storm. Kevin burst out, his lean frame clad in a sharp suit, his dark eyes wild with relief and rage. He sprinted to Calvin, pulling him into a fierce hug, heedless of the blood and salt. Fuck man, you look like hell, Kevin said, stepping back, his hands gripping Calvin's shoulders. But you're alive, thank God. Calvin managed a crooked grin, pain lancing through his split lip. Takes more than a psycho pilot to kill me, Kev, he rasped, voice thick with exhaustion and grit. Kevin's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. Harris is toast, he said, voice low, lethal. Mia's talking, passengers too. We've got video witnesses, everything. Lawyers are on it, and the media's about to blow up. Calvin nodded, his mind sharpening, the fog of pain clearing. Good, he said, but I'm going public myself. World needs to hear this from me. Kevin smirked, a glint of pride in his eyes. That's my boy. Let's get you cleaned up, patched up, and on camera. That bastard won't know what hit him. The helicopter lifted off, the village shrinking below, Amos and the others waving, their faces fierce with solidarity. Calvin leaned against the window, the blanket still around him, his battered body aching but alive. His mind churned, relief warring with rage, gratitude clashing with a hunger for justice. He saw Harris's face, heard his taunts, felt the ropes, the punches, the plunge. His hands shook, not from fear, but from a resolve forged in salt water and blood. He'd been a victim, a survivor, but now he was a weapon, honed and ready. Harris had tried to erase him, but Calvin Jones wasn't going anywhere. He was coming back, louder, stronger, and with a reckoning that would shake the skies. The helicopter's blades sliced through the dawn, a relentless roar that drowned out the whispers of the ocean below as it carried Calvin Jones, Big C, away from the fishing village that had cradled him back to life. His battered body slumped against the seat, the coarse blanket still draped over his shoulders, his faded black t-shirt stiff with dried salt water and blood. His scuffed sneakers left wet smears on the floor, and his swollen eye throbbed beneath a makeshift bandage, the split lips stinging with every breath. The silver bracelet on his wrist glinted faintly, a tether to his past amidst the wreckage of his present. Bruises blooming across his face, cuts crusting over, a roadmap of survival etched in flesh. Beside him, Kevin's sharp suit was a stark contrast, his dark eyes blazing with a mix of relief and fury, his hands clenched as if ready to throttle the world itself. Calvin stared out the window, the coastline fading into a blur, his mind a tempest of rage, exhaustion, and a steely resolve that burned hotter than the pain. Inside he was a furnace. Every thud of the chopper's blades echoed the punches Daniel Harris had rained down, each fist a hammer, each curse, fucking thug, piece of shit, a brand seared into his soul. He saw the ropes binding his wrists, felt the gut-wrenching plunge into the ocean, the cold swallowing him whole. He'd fought free, clawed his way back, but the memory clung like damp rot, festering in his chest. His hands shook, not from the chill still lingering in his bones, but from a hunger, a primal gnawing need to see Harris broken, to make him feel the terror Calvin had tasted in that endless sea. It scared him how deep that darkness ran, how it coiled around his heart like an old street instinct he'd buried under beats and rhymes. But he wouldn't bury it now. Not this time. Kevin's voice cut through the roar, sharp and urgent. "We're landing in an hour, Cal. Private strip outside LA, lawyers are ready, media's buzzing. Mia's safe, talking to the cops, and passengers are spilling everything. We've got video shaky, but it's gold. Harris is fucked." Calvin nodded, his swollen eye twitching, his voice a rasp. "Good. But I'm going live first, Kev. World needs to hear this from me, straight, no filter." Kevin's lips twitched, a grim smirk breaking through. "That's my man. We'll set it up at the house. Camera, mic, the works. You tell your story and we'll watch that bastard burn." The chopper descended, touching down on a sun-scorched strip flanked by scrubland and warehouses, a black SUV waiting like a predator in the dust. Calvin stepped out, legs wobbly but steadying with every step, the blanket falling away as he straightened, his 6-foot frame a battered tower of defiance. Fans had already gathered, word had leaked, wildfire fast, holding signs scrawled with "Welcome home, Big C," and "Justice for Calvin." Their cheers hit him like a wave, a roar of love and fury that drowned out the chopper's fading hum. He raised a hand, forcing a crooked grin through the pain, his swollen face a testament to the war he'd survived. "Good to be back," he muttered, voice lost to the crowd, but the fire in his eyes spoke louder. The ride to his LA mansion was a blur, Kevin barking orders into his phone, lawyers, PR, news outlets, while Calvin stared out the tinted window, the city sprawl a jagged mirror to his fractured mind. He saw Harris's sneer, heard Mia's cries, felt the ropes again, and his fists clenched, nails digging into his palms until blood welled. He wasn't just angry, he was haunted, a man teetering on a razor's edge between justice and something darker. Something that whispered make him bleed in the quiet corners of his soul. He shook it off, focusing on the plan, go live, tell the truth, let the world do the rest. But that whisper lingered, a shadow he couldn't outrun. At the house, Kevin's team moved like a machine, camera rigged in Calvin's office, lights glaring, a mic thrust into his hand. He stood before the lens, still in his soaked shirt, blood crusted on his face, refusing the clean clothes Kevin offered. "This is me," he growled, voice rough as sandpaper. "This is what he did. Let him see it." Kevin nodded, his jaw tight, and hit record, the red light blinking like a heartbeat. Calvin's million-strong followers flooded the stream, the chat exploding. "Big C, you okay? What happened? We're with you." A tidal wave of support he felt through the screen. He took a breath, the mic trembling in his grip, and began. "Yo, it's your boy, Calvin Jones, Big C. he said, voice low, steady, but laced with a raw edge that silenced the world. I know y'all been wondering where I've been, why I dropped off the map. This ain't a story I ever thought I'd tell, but here it is, unfiltered, real as it gets. He paused, his swollen eye glinting under the lights, blood flaking from his lip as he spoke. I boarded a private jet to the Maldives looking for peace. What I got was a nightmare. Captain Daniel Harris, he saw me, a black man in his fancy cabin, and lost his damn mind. Called me a thug, a parasite, trash. Beat me till I bled, tied my hands, threw scalding coffee in my face. Then he dragged me out mid-flight and dropped me into the ocean to die. The chat erupted, WTF. That's insane. Kill that bastard. A storm of outrage that mirrored the fire in his chest. He leaned closer, voice dropping to a growl. I fought the ropes, swam, till my lungs gave out, 'cause I wasn't letting him win. Fishermen pulled me from the water, good people, real people, and now I'm here, still standing. But this ain't just about me. It's about every one of us who's been told we don't belong, who's been kicked down for how we look, where we're from. Harris thought he could erase me. Nah, not today. We're fighting back and we ain't stopping, till justice hits him like a freight train. He slammed the mic down, the thud echoing, and Kevin cut the feed, the screen dark but the world alight. Within minutes, the video went viral, trending globally, #Justice for Big C dominating timelines, celebrities and activists amplifying his cry, fans flooding the streets with protests. Calvin sank into a chair, his head pounding, the adrenaline draining fast, leaving a hollow ache. Kevin clapped his shoulder, voice tight. You did it, man. They're tearing Harris apart out there. Calvin nodded, but his mind churned, relief warring with a restless hunger, a need to see Harris's face when the walls closed in. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. News outlets ran the story nonstop. Racist pilot attempts murder of rap icon, headlines screaming over footage of Calvin's bruised face. The airline scrambled, issuing a limp apology, distancing itself from Harris, but the public wasn't buying it. Boycotts flared, stocks tanked. Kevin's legal team filed a lawsuit, airtight with Mia's testimony, passenger videos, and the fisherman's statements, while the FAA launched an investigation, Harris's license hanging by a thread. Calvin watched it unfold from his couch, ice pressed to his swollen eye, his body healing but his mind racing. He saw the support, millions strong, but felt the weight too, a mantle he hadn't asked for, a symbol of something bigger than himself. Inside he was a storm. He'd sleep and the ocean would drag him under again. Harris's fists, the ropes, the plunge, waking him in cold sweats, his fists swinging at shadows. He'd pace his office, the silver bracelet a lifeline, his mind wrestling with what he wanted, justice sure but also something rawer, something that whispered break him in the dark. He hated that voice, hated how it felt like home, a street kid's instinct he'd buried under fame. But Harris had unearthed it and Calvin couldn't unfeel it, couldn't silence the part of him that wanted to see that bastard beg. The courtroom loomed, a packed chamber of flashing cameras, activists chanting outside, journalists jostling for sound bites. Calvin stepped from the SUV, his bruised face still raw, dressed in a simple black hoodie and jeans, refusing the suit Kevin suggested. This is me, he said, voice firm. Let him see the real. Kevin nodded, his hand on Calvin's back as they pushed through the crowd, cheers and cries of Big C ringing in his ears. Inside, the air was thick, tension coiling like a spring, every eye on him as he took his seat, his swollen eye scanning the room. Harris sat at the defendant's table, his navy uniform replaced by a cheap suit, his light brown hair slicked back, his green eyes cold but flickering with something new, fear, maybe, or defiance. He wouldn't look at Calvin, his jaw tight, his hands clasped like a man clinging to a ledge. Calvin stared, his fists clenching under the table, that dark whisper rising, make him pay, make him hurt. He forced it down, breathing slow, focusing on the gavel's crack as the judge called order, the trial beginning with a weight that pressed on his chest. The prosecution opened, a civil rights attorney named Lena Carter, a fierce woman with a voice like steel, laying out the case with surgical precision. This isn't about a flight gone wrong, she declared, her gaze sweeping the jury. This is about prejudice, about a man, Daniel Harris, who abused his power to assault, humiliate, and attempt to murder Calvin Jones because of who he is, what he represents. This is about justice, for Mr. Jones and for every soul who's faced that hate. Her words hit Calvin like a punch, pride and pain twisting together, his swollen eyes stinging with unshed tears. Witnesses took the stand, Mia, her voice trembling but resolute, recounting Harris's rage, the coffee, the punches. Passengers, their shaky footage played on a screen, gasps rippling through the room as Harris's fists flew. Calvin watched, his jaw tight, the memories crashing back, each blow a fresh wound, each curse a lash. He wanted to look away but he couldn't, his gaze locked on Harris who sat rigid, pale, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. That whisper grew louder, "He's scared now, finish him," and Calvin gripped the table, knuckles white, fighting it down. The defense floundered, claiming Harris acted for safety, painting Calvin as a threat, but Lena dismantled it, her voice a blade. Safety? Beating a man, tying him, dropping him into the sea, that's not safety, that's attempted murder. She turned to Calvin, her eyes steady. Mr. Jones isn't on trial here. His character isn't the question. What's on trial is this man's hate, his abuse, his crime. The jury watched, faces grim, and Calvin felt their weight, a silent army behind him. The final blow came with the fisherman's testimony, Amos, his gray beard bristling, his voice a growl as he described pulling Calvin from the waves, half dead, beaten to hell. The courtroom stilled, the air heavy, and Calvin's throat tightened, gratitude and rage choking him. Harris shifted, his hands trembling, and for the first time their eyes met, green clashing with brown, fear meeting fire. Calvin didn't blink, his stare a promise, a blade held to Harris's throat, and that dark whisper roared, "You're mine." Closing arguments sealed it, Lena's voice rising, a call to arms. This is about accountability, about ensuring no one endures what Mr. Jones did. The jury deliberated, 3 hours that stretched like years, Calvin pacing outside, Kevin's hand on his shoulder, the crowd's chants a heartbeat in the air. When the verdict came, guilty on assault, endangerment, attempted murder, the room erupted, cheers drowning the gavel, Harris's head dropping, his face ashen. Outside, Calvin faced the cameras, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "This ain't just my win," he said, swollen eye glinting. "It's ours, every one of us who's been knocked down. Justice hit today and we're keeping it comin'." The crowd roared, a tidal wave of triumph, but inside Calvin burned. Relief, yes, but that whisper lingered, unsatisfied, hungry. Harris was down, license revoked, prison bound, but Calvin's war wasn't over. Not until he faced that bastard one last time, saw the fear in his eyes, and silenced the darkness within. The Los Angeles courtroom pulsed with a suffocating tension, its polished wood walls and high ceilings trapping the heat of 100 held breaths. Calvin Jones, Big C, sat rigid at the plaintiff's table, his bruised hands clenched beneath the surface, the silver bracelet on his wrist a cold anchor against the fire raging in his chest. His faded black hoodie hung loose over his broad frame, his scuffed sneakers silent on the floor, but his swollen eye, still purpled and half shut, burned with a quiet fury that could have scorched the room. Blood crusted his split lip, a badge of the war he'd survived, and his dark brown eyes locked on Daniel Harris across the chamber, a predator sizing up prey. The air crackled, electric with anticipation, every whisper and rustle a spark ready to ignite. This was it, Judgment Day, and Calvin felt it in his bones, a reckoning he'd clawed his way back from the ocean to claim. The jury filed in, their faces grim, etched with the weight of 3 hours' deliberation. Calvin's pulse hammered, a war drum in his ears, drowning out the murmurs of the packed gallery, fans, activists, reporters, their eyes boring into him like spotlights. Kevin sat beside him, his sharp suit a shield, his hand gripping Calvin's shoulder with a fierceness that said, "We've got this." Mia was there too in the front row, her bruised cheek a mirror to Calvin's own, her blue eyes wet but steady, a silent pillar of strength. Lena Carter, the civil rights attorney, stood poised at the podium, her voice a blade ready to cut, but it was Harris who drew Calvin's gaze, slumped at the defendant's table, his cheap suit wrinkled, his light brown hair slick with sweat, his green eyes darting like a cornered animal's. He wouldn't look at Calvin, not yet, and that cowardice stoked the ember in Calvin's gut into a blaze. Inside he was a storm on a leash. Every second in this room dragged him back, Harris's fists slamming into his face, the ropes biting his wrists, the gut-wrenching plunge into the sea. He'd tasted blood and salt water, fought the dark pulling him under and survived, but the scars weren't just on his skin. They were in his head, a relentless loop of rage and helplessness, a whisper that had grown into a roar, "Make him pay, make him bleed." It scared him how natural it felt, how it echoed the street kid he'd been, the one who'd punched back at the world to survive. He'd buried that kid under music, under fame, but Harris had dug him up, and now Calvin wrestled with him, a shadow he couldn't shake. The judge's gavel cracked, a gunshot in the silence, and the room stilled. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked, voice deep, commanding. The foreman, a wiry man with graying hair, stood, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded a paper. "We have, Your Honor," he said, voice steady but tight. Calvin's breath caught, his swollen eye twitching, his fists clenching harder until his nails dug crescents into his palms. Kevin's grip tightened, a lifeline, and Lena's gaze flicked to Calvin, a nod of steel. Across the room Harris shifted, his shoulders hunching, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the table. Fear, Calvin realized, and it tasted like ash in his mouth. "On the charge of assault," the foreman read, "we find the defendant, Daniel Harris, guilty." A murmur rippled through the gallery, sharp and electric. "On the charge of endangerment, guilty." The murmurs grew, a rising tide. "On the charge of attempted murder, guilty." The room exploded, cheers, gasps, shouts crashing together in a deafening wave, the gavel pounding uselessly as the crowd surged to its feet. Kevin slammed a fist on the table, a triumphant "yes" tearing from his throat, while Mia buried her face in her hands, sobbing with relief. Lena turned, her fierce eyes glinting, and clapped Calvin's arm, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We did it, Calvin. He's done." But Calvin didn't move, didn't cheer. His gaze stayed locked on Harris, who'd gone deathly pale, his green eyes wide, his mouth twitching like a man unmoored. For the first time Harris looked at him, really looked, and Calvin saw it. Terror, raw and naked, a mirror to the fear Calvin had felt plummeting into the ocean. That dark whisper roared louder, "He's yours now, break him," and Calvin's hands shook, his breath shallow, teetering on the edge of something he couldn't name. Justice was here, tangible, but it didn't silence the hunger, didn't quench the fire. He wanted more, needed more, and that need clawed at his soul. The judge's voice boomed, restoring order, his gavel a thunderclap. "Daniel Harris, stand," he commanded, and Harris rose, unsteady, his cheap suit sagging like a shroud. The judge's eyes were cold, unyielding. "Your actions were not just a crime, they were a betrayal of trust, a vicious assault driven by prejudice and malice. This court sentences you to 25 years without parole, effective immediately. Your pilot's license is revoked permanently, and you will pay restitution to Mr. Jones for the remainder of your miserable life." Each word landed like a hammer, and Harris flinched, his shoulders slumping, his green eyes glazing over as bailiffs moved in, cuffs gleaming in the harsh light. Calvin watched, his chest tight, as the cuffs snapped shut, Harris's wrists bound, a twisted echo of the ropes that had tied him. The captain, no, the convict, stumbled as they dragged him away, his head bowed, his defiance shattered. The gallery erupted again, chants of justice for Big C, shaking the walls, but Calvin's world narrowed to that moment. Harris's broken silhouette disappearing through the door, the clang of metal a final note in their war. Kevin pulled him into a fierce hug, his voice hoarse. "You won, man. It's over." Mia joined them, her arms trembling around Calvin, her tears soaking his hoodie. "Thank you," she whispered, and Calvin nodded, his throat too tight to speak. But it wasn't over, not inside him. He stepped outside, the LA sun blinding, the crowd a sea of faces, fans, cameras, fists raised in solidarity. He faced them, mic thrust into his hand, his swollen eye glinting under the glare. "This ain't just my win," he said, voice raw, steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It's ours, every one of us who's been told we ain't enough, who's been knocked down for who we are." Harris is locked up, his wings clipped, but this fight? It's bigger than him. "We're here, we're loud, and we ain't stoppin'." The crowd roared, a tidal wave of triumph, their love a balm to his wounds, but that whisper lingered, a shadow in the noise, "It's not enough." Back at his mansion, the silence hit hard. Kevin and the team celebrated, champagne popped, laughter echoed, but Calvin slipped away, pacing his office, the silver bracelet a lifeline as his mind churned. Harris was gone, caged, stripped, finished, but the fire in Calvin's chest wouldn't die. He saw the ocean again, felt the ropes, heard Harris's taunts, and his fists clenched, punching the air, a silent scream tearing at his throat. He'd won justice but not peace. That dark whisper, "Make him bleed," still echoed, a street instinct he couldn't bury, and it terrified him how much he craved it, how it felt like a piece of him he'd lost. He sank into a chair, head in his hands, the weight of it all crashing down, survival, trial, victory, and the void left behind. Kevin found him, his sharp eyes softening as he crouched beside him. "Talk to me, Cal," he said, voice low, steady. "You're here but you ain't here." Calvin exhaled, ragged, his swollen eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I got him, Kev," he rasped, "but it don't feel done. I wanted him down, wanted him scared, broken, but now he's locked up and I'm still—" He trailed off, fists clenching, the words too heavy to speak. Kevin nodded, his hand firm on Calvin's shoulder. You're still fighting him in here, he said, tapping Calvin's chest. He put you through hell, man, tied you, beat you, dropped you to die. That don't just fade, 'cause a judge swings a gavel. You're human, Cal, not a saint, not a machine. You're allowed to feel this. Calvin looked up, his dark eyes haunted, meeting Kevin's steady gaze. I wanted to kill him, Kev, he admitted, voice a whisper raw with shame. Still do some days. That ain't right, is it? Kevin's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed soft. Right? Maybe not. Human? Hell yeah. You didn't kill him. You fought smarter, hit harder where it counts. He's rotting in a cell, 'cause of you, not dead in a ditch. That's strength, man, not weakness. Calvin swallowed, the knot in his chest loosening just a fraction. Kevin was right. He'd chosen justice over blood, channeled that street fire into something bigger. But the whisper lingered, quieter now, a shadow he'd carry, not wield. Days bled into weeks, the world still buzzing. #Justice for Big C, a rallying cry, the airline settling out of court for millions, Harris's name a curse on every tongue. Calvin healed, his bruises fading, his swollen eye clearing, but he kept the silver bracelet, a reminder of the fight, the survival. He went back to the studio, the beat his refuge, pouring the ocean, the ropes, the rage into lyrics that hit harder than ever, raw, real, a testament to the man who'd walked through hell and come out swinging. One night, he stood on his balcony, the LA skyline glittering below, the air cool against his scarred face. He saw Harris's broken silhouette again, heard the cuffs snap, felt the crowd's roar, and for the first time the whisper was silent. Not gone but still, a shadow tamed by the light he'd ignited. He'd faced the darkness, wrestled it and won, not just against Harris but within himself. The Maldives could wait. Peace was here, fragile but real, in the rhythm of his breath, the beat in his soul. Calvin Jones, Big C, wasn't just alive. He was unstoppable. The Los Angeles skyline shimmered beneath a bruising dusk, its jagged edges softened by the golden haze of a city still buzzing with the echoes of Calvin Jones's triumph. Big C stood on his balcony, the cool breeze tugging at his faded black hoodie, his scuffed sneakers silent on the polished concrete. His swollen eye had faded to a faint shadow, his split lip a thin scar, but the silver bracelet on his wrist glinted like a battle-worn talisman, a reminder of the war he'd fought and won. Below, the streets pulsed with life, fans still chanting his name, billboards flashing #Justice for Big C, a movement he'd ignited with his battered voice and unyielding spirit. Daniel Harris was gone, caged for 25 years, his wings clipped, his name a curse, but Calvin's chest still burned, a restless ember flickering between victory and the ghost that refused to fade. Inside, his mansion was a fortress of sound, Kevin barking orders into his phone, the legal team toasting with champagne, their laughter a sharp counterpoint to the quiet storm in Calvin's mind. The trial was over, the gavel's crack a final note in Harris's downfall, but Calvin felt it like a half-finished song. Triumphant, yes, but incomplete. He saw Harris's green eyes wide with terror as the cuffs snapped shut, heard the crowd's roar, felt the ocean's pull, and that dark whisper, "Make him bleed," still lingered, a shadow he'd tamed but couldn't kill. It scared him, how it clung like damp rot, how it echoed the street kid he'd been, the one who'd punched back at a world that never gave him a chance. He'd chosen justice over vengeance, channeled that fire into a wind that shook the skies, but the cost was a restlessness he couldn't name. Kevin stepped onto the balcony, his sharp suit rumpled, a glass of champagne dangling from his hand. "You good, Cal?" he asked, voice low, cutting through the breeze. His dark eyes searched Calvin's face, reading the tension in his jaw, the distant flicker in his brown eyes. Calvin exhaled, leaning on the railing, the metal cold against his palms. "Yeah, Kev," he rasped, voice still rough from the salt water and screams. "Just processing. Won the war, but it don't feel like peace yet." Kevin nodded, sipping his drink, his gaze steady. "You went through hell, man, tied up, beaten, dropped in the damn ocean. That don't just vanish, 'cause Harris is locked up. Give it time, you'll find your rhythm again." Tom. Calvin wanted to believe it, but the nights told a different story. Sleep fractured by nightmares, the ropes biting his wrists, Harris's fists raining down, the plunge into the abyss. He'd wake in a cold sweat, fists swinging at shadows, his heart a war drum he couldn't silence. He'd pace the studio, the beat his lifeline, pouring the pain into tracks that hit harder than ever, raw, visceral, a howl of survival that millions devoured. His latest drop, Ocean's Edge, was climbing charts, its lyrics a knife to the gut. "Tied me down, threw me deep, but I rose, I breathe," and fans flooded his streams, their love a tidal wave that both lifted and drowned him. He was Big C, the icon, the survivor, but beneath it he was Calvin, still wrestling with the man he'd become. The world wouldn't let him rest. The airline crumbled under boycotts and lawsuits, settling out of court for a fortune. Millions Calvin funneled into charities for kids like he'd been, lost in the streets with nothing but a dream. The FAA banned Harris for life, his name blacklisted, his legacy ash. News cycles spun. Rap icon's victory over racist pilot, Big C's fight fuels change. And activists rallied, turning his story into a torch against hate. Mia called, her voice steady now, thanking him for speaking, for surviving. She'd quit flying, opened a cafe, a quiet life Calvin envied. But the spotlight clung relentless. Interviews, awards, demands for more, and Calvin felt it like a weight, a crown he hadn't sought. Inside he was a battlefield. He'd stand in his office, the silver bracelet a lifeline, staring at the ocean painting on the wall, a gift from a fan, its waves a mirror to his nightmares. He'd see Harris's sneer, hear his taunts, "You don't belong in my sky," and his fists would clench, nails digging into his palms until blood welled. That dark whisper rose, quieter now but persistent, "He's not suffering enough," and he'd punch the air, a silent scream tearing at his throat. He hated it, how it felt like home, how Harris had unearthed a piece of him he'd buried under fame. A street kid's rage, a hunger for retribution he couldn't fully shake. Justice had won, but peace was a ghost, slipping through his fingers like sand. Kevin saw it, dragged him out. Studio sessions, rooftop talks, anything to keep him moving. "You're bigger than this, Cal," he'd say, voice firm, his hand a steady grip. "Harris is rotting, you're soaring. Don't let him keep you caged." Calvin nodded, forcing a grin, but the words echoed hollow. He was soaring, millions cheered, tracks blazed, the world bent to his will, but the cage was inside, a prison of memory and shadow he couldn't break. He needed out, needed air, needed the peace he'd chased before Harris turned his sky into a battlefield. The Maldives. The dream he'd lost, the white sands and turquoise waves he'd craved, a sanctuary stolen by hate. Kevin booked it, a private jet, new crew vetted tight, insisting, "You earned this, man. Go heal." Calvin hesitated, the jet a trigger, its hum a ghost of Harris's roar, but he packed. A faded t-shirt, jeans, the silver bracelet, and boarded, his heart a knot of dread and defiance. The cabin gleamed, plush and quiet, no trace of the chaos he'd endured, and the pilot, a calm woman named Tara, greeted him, her handshake firm, her eyes kind. "Safe skies, Mr. Jones," she said, and Calvin nodded, sinking into a seat, the engines a soft lullaby as they lifted off. The flight was smooth, clouds parting like a curtain, but Calvin's mind churned. He saw Harris's fists, felt the ropes, tasted the ocean, and his fists clenched, the bracelet biting his wrist. He'd survived. Won, but why did it feel like a draw? The whisper crept back, he's still breathing, still living, and he gripped the armrest, his swollen eyes ghost throbbing, a reminder of the war he'd fought alone. He closed his eyes, forcing the beat into his head. I rose, I breathe. A mantra against the dark, and slowly the tension eased, the hum of the jet a bomb he hadn't expected. Landing in the Maldives was a shock of beauty, white sands stretching endless, waves crashing soft, the air warm and alive. Calvin stepped off, barefoot, the sand a caress against his scuffed soles, and exhaled, a ragged breath that carried the weight of months. His villa perched over the water, glass walls framing a sea that shimmered silver under the moon, and he stood on the deck, the breeze tugging his hoodie, the silver bracelet glinting like a star. This was it, peace, finally, but the ghosts lingered, shadows in the waves, Harris's sneer a faint echo in the wind. He swam, the water cool against his scarred skin, each stroke a defiance of the ocean that had nearly claimed him. He floated, staring at the sky, and the memories crashed. Ropes, fists, the plunge, but this time they didn't drown him. He saw Harris's broken silhouette, heard the cuffs snap, felt the crowd's roar, and the whisper was there, not enough, but quieter, a murmur he could face. He wasn't that street kid anymore, not fully. He'd built something bigger, turned pain into power, hate into hope. The ocean hadn't won, Harris hadn't won, he had. Back on the deck, he sat, legs dangling over the edge, the waves a soft rhythm below. Kevin called, voice crackling through the phone, "How's paradise, Cal?" Calvin grinned, the scar on his lip tugging. "It's good, Kev," he said, voice steady, lighter than it had been in months. "Real good." Kevin laughed, relief thick in it. "Told you, man. Heal up, we've got tracks to drop, worlds to shake." Calvin nodded, hanging up, his eyes on the horizon, the ember in his chest cooling to a glow, not gone but controlled, a fire he'd mastered. The nights were quiet, the villa a cocoon, soft bed, open sky, the beat of his heart sinking with the waves. He'd wake, not to nightmares but to dawn, the gold painting the sea a promise of something new. He wrote, lyrics flowing raw and real, a story of survival that'd echo beyond him. The whisper was there, a shadow in the margins, but he didn't fight it. He faced it, let it sit, a piece of him he'd carry but not wield. Harris was caged, his life ash, and Calvin was free, not just alive but whole, a man who'd walked through hell and found his way back. On his last day he stood on the beach, the sun blazing, the sand warm beneath his feet. He pulled the silver bracelet off, holding it up, its gleam a mirror to the man he'd become, scarred, yes, but unbroken, a survivor who'd turned darkness into light. He tossed it into the waves, a quiet offering not to forget but to release. The ocean took it, a ripple fading into the vast, and Calvin exhaled, long and slow, the weight lifting, peace settling like a beat he'd finally mastered. He boarded the jet home, Tara's voice warm over the intercom, "Safe skies, Mr. Jones," and he smiled, real this time, his dark eyes clear. The engines roared, the Maldives shrinking below, and Calvin leaned back, the rhythm of his breath a song of triumph. Harris was a memory, the whisper a ghost he'd tamed, and the world waited. His world, his beat, his victory. Big C was back, louder than ever, and the sky was his again. The Los Angeles skyline blazed under a molten sunset, its towers of glass and steel catching the fire of a city reborn in Calvin Jones's name. Big C stepped off the private jet, his faded black hoodie loose over his broad frame, his scuffed sneakers hitting the tarmac with a quiet thud that echoed like a drumbeat. The Maldives salt still clung to his skin, its waves a whisper in his veins, but his dark brown eyes, once shadowed by bruises, gleamed with a clarity sharper than ever. The silver bracelet was gone, offered to the ocean, but its weight lingered in his soul, a badge of the war he'd won, not just against Daniel Harris, but against the darkness that had nearly claimed him. The air crackled with anticipation, a city holding its breath, and Calvin felt it, a rhythm rising, a beat he'd mastered, ready to shake the world. The tarmac buzzed, a swarm of fans and cameras surging forward, their cheers a tidal wave that crashed over him. Big C. Big C. Their signs flashing hashtag justice for Big C in bold, defiant strokes. Kevin waited by a black SUV, his sharp suit crisp, his dark eyes glinting with pride as he pulled Calvin into a fierce hug. "Welcome home, man," he said, voice thick, clapping Calvin's back hard enough to jolt his healed ribs. "You look good, damn good." Calvin grinned, the scar on his lip tugging, a badge of survival. "Feel good, Kev?" he rasped, his voice steady, lighter than it had been in months. Maldives worked its magic. "I'm back for real." Inside he was a furnace reignited, not with rage but with purpose. The ocean had washed away the last of Harris's poison, the ropes and fists fading to echoes, the whisper, "Make him bleed," silenced by the waves. He'd stood on that beach, tossed the bracelet and let go, not of the fight but of the weight, the shadow that had haunted him since the plunge. It wasn't gone forever. He knew that street kid lingered, a flicker in his core, but he'd tamed it, turned it into fuel, a fire that burned clean now, driving him forward. Harris was caged, his life ash, and Calvin was free, free to rise, to reclaim, to roar. The ride home was electric, Kevin briefing him, voice rapid fire, "Studios ready, tours booked, Ocean's Edge is platinum, fans are losing their minds, Cal. You're a goddamn phoenix." Calvin nodded, his gaze on the city blurring past, its lights a mirror to the spark in his chest. The trial, the verdict, the millions pouring in, he'd funneled it all into schools, shelters, beats for kids like he'd been, turning pain into power. The world had watched, rallied, made him a symbol, but now he was more. Big C, the man who'd walked through hell and come out swinging, ready to claim his sky. At the mansion the team swarmed, producers, stylists, PR buzzing like bees, but Calvin waved them off, heading straight for the studio. The walls thrummed with memory, nights pacing, punching shadows, pouring the ocean into tracks, and he sank into the chair, the mic a lifeline, the beat a pulse. He'd written in the Maldives, lyrics raw and real, a story of survival that hit harder than ever. "Drown me deep, cut me free, now I'm the storm you'll see," and he laid it down, voice a growl that shook the glass, a howl of triumph that millions would feel in their bones. The sound was his weapon, his victory, a middle finger to Harris and every doubt that had ever clawed at him. Inside he wrestled still, not with rage but with legacy. He'd see Harris's green eyes in the dark, hear his taunts, "You don't belong," and his fists would clench, a reflex of the street kid he'd been. But now he'd breathe, let the beat take it, turn it into fuel. The Maldives had stripped him bare, left him raw, but it had rebuilt him too, stronger, clearer, a man who'd faced the abyss and walked away whole. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving, and that truth hummed in his veins, a rhythm he couldn't lose. The night of his comeback show loomed, a sold-out stadium, 80,000 strong, their chants shaking the concrete as Calvin waited backstage, the roar a tidal wave through the curtains. Kevin paced beside him, his suit swapped for a leather jacket, his voice sharp with excitement. "This is it, Cal, your moment. They're here for you, every damn one of them." Calvin nodded, tugging his hoodie strings, his dark eyes glinting under the dim lights. He wore no bling, no flash, just the faded black, the jeans, the sneakers. A man unadorned, unstoppable. The stage was his battlefield now, the mic his sword, and he was ready to strike. The lights dropped, a hush falling, then his beat kicked in, Ocean's Edge, a bass line that rattled the stands, a growl that split the silence. Calvin stepped out, the spotlight blinding, the crowd erupting, screams, tears, fists raised in a sea of fury and love. He gripped the mic, his voice a thunderclap. "Yo, it's Big C, your boy who fell and rose." The stadium shook, 80,000 voices roaring back, and he launched in, "Tied my hands, threw me down, thought I'd drown, wore no crown, but I'm here, hear me now." Each word a blade, each note a fist, his scars a banner of survival. He moved, pacing, leaping, sweat dripping, the beat a lifeline, the crowd his army. They sang with him, their voices a chorus that drowned the ghosts, Harris's fists, the ropes, the plunge, until it was just Calvin, the mic, the rhythm of a man reborn. His swollen eyes ghost throbbed, a memory of pain, but he grinned through it, the scar on his lip a defiant curl, and the crowd felt it. His fire, his fight, his triumph. "This ain't just my win," he roared mid-track, voice raw. "It's ours, every one of us who's been knocked down, told we ain't shit. We're here, we're loud, and we ain't stoppin'." The stadium erupted, a seismic wave, and Calvin stood, chest heaving, the beat fading, their love a balm to every wound. Backstage, he collapsed into a chair, sweat-soaked, his breath ragged, Kevin's hand clapping his shoulder. "You killed it, man, killed it dead," Kevin said, voice thick with pride. Mia slipped in, her cafe apron swapped for a jacket, her blue eyes shining as she hugged him, soft but fierce. "You're unstoppable, Calvin," she whispered, and he nodded, his throat tight, her words a mirror to the truth he'd found. The crew swarmed, producers, fans, VIPs, but Calvin slipped away, needing air, needing quiet, the roar still ringing in his ears. He stood on the stadium roof, the city sprawling below, its lights a constellation of his victory. The breeze cooled his skin, tugging his hoodie, and he exhaled, long and slow, the ember in his chest a steady glow, not rage but strength, a fire he'd claimed. He saw Harris's broken silhouette, heard the cuffs snap, felt the ocean's pull, but they were shadows now, faint and powerless. The whisper, "Not enough," was gone, drowned by the beat, the crowd, the man he'd become. He'd fought, street kid, survivor, icon, and won not just against Harris but within, a peace forged in the crucible of pain. Days later, he sat in his office, the ocean painting on the wall a quiet testament, the mic silent on the desk. Kevin barged in, his grin wide, "Tours doubling, Europe, Asia, they're begging for you, Cal." Calvin laughed, a real laugh, the scar tugging painless now. "Let's do it, Kev," he said, voice steady. "World ain't ready for this beat." Kevin nodded, clapping his hands, but Calvin's gaze drifted to the window, the sky a canvas of dusk, and he felt it, freedom real and raw, a rhythm he'd mastered at last. He'd visit the fishing village soon, Amos, Maria, Javi, bring them beats, build them a studio, repay the hands that pulled him from the waves. He'd call Mia, check her cafe, keep her close, a sister born of shared scars. But tonight he stood alone, the city humming below, his dark eyes clear, his breath a song. The Maldives had healed him, the stage had crowned him, and the world had lifted him. A man who'd walked through hell, faced the dark, and come out shining. Harris was ash, the whisper dust, and Calvin Jones, Big C, was unstoppable, his beat a thunder that'd echo forever. Hey folks, hope you vibed with Calvin's journey and the fire in this tale. Did you love the story and the way it unfolded? If you're feeling it, drop a 1 in the comments. If it didn't hit for you, leave it too. Either way, let me know what you think. This is your story too. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button on Soul Deep Stories over on YouTube for more raw, real narratives like this. Let's keep the beat alive. Peace out. The London night pulsed with a feral energy, its skyline a jagged crown of steel and neon ablaze under a storm-swept sky. Calvin Jones, Big C, stood backstage at Wembley Stadium, the roar of 90,000 fans a seismic wave crashing through the concrete, their chants, "Big C, Big C," a heartbeat shaking the air. His faded black hoodie hung loose over his broad frame, his scuffed sneakers planted firm, the scar on his lip a faint crescent under the dim lights. His dark brown eyes gleamed with a fire honed by survival, the silver bracelet gone but its weight etched in his soul, a relic of the war he'd fought and won. The Maldives had cleansed him, the stage had crowned him, and now the world waited, breathless, for the beat that'd redefine him. But beneath the triumph, a shadow flickered, a whisper he thought he'd silenced, and tonight, it'd test him one last time. The tour, Unbreakable, was a global thunderclap, sold out from London to Tokyo, millions clamoring for the man who'd risen from the ocean's jaws. Kevin paced beside him, his leather jacket creaking, his dark eyes sharp with a mix of pride and nerves. "This is it, Cal," he said, voice cutting through the roar, "your biggest night yet, 90,000 souls out there ready to lose their damn minds." Calvin nodded, tugging his hoodie strings, his grin crooked but fierce. "Let's give him hell, Kev," he rasped, voice steady, a growl tempered by peace. He was back, Big C the Phoenix, the survivor, and the stage was his kingdom, the mic his scepter, ready to reign. Inside he was a furnace of light and shadow. The Maldives had washed away the last of Daniel Harris's venom, the ropes and fists fading to scars, the whisper, "Make him bleed," drowned by waves and beats. He'd faced it, tamed it, turned it into fuel, a fire that burned clean now, driving him to heights he'd never dreamed. Harris was caged, his life ash, his name a curse, and Calvin had soared, platinum tracks, a movement, a legacy forged in pain and power. But the street kid lingered, a flicker in his core, a reflex of rage he'd mastered but couldn't erase. Tonight, that flicker would flare, a final test of the man he'd become. The lights dropped, a hush falling like a guillotine, then his beat kicked in, Ocean's Edge, a bass line that rattled the stadium, a growl that split the dark. Calvin strode out, the spotlight blinding, the crowd erupting, screams, tears, fists raised in a sea of fury and love that shook the earth. He gripped the mic, his voice a thunderbolt, "London, it's your boy Big C, fallen, risen, unbroken." The stands exploded, 90,000 voices roaring back, and he launched in, "Tied my soul through me deep, but I clawed, I breathe." Each word a blade, each note a fist, his scars a banner of defiance that lit the night. He moved, pacing, leaping, sweat dripping, the beat a lifeline, the crowd his legion. They sang with him, their voices a chorus that drowned the ghosts, Harris's sneer, the plunge, the cold, until it was just Calvin, the mic, the rhythm of a man reborn. His scar gleamed under the lights, a defiant curl, and the crowd felt it, his fire, his fight, his soul. "This is ours," he roared mid-track, voice raw, "every one of us who's been knocked down, told we're nothing, we're the storm now and we ain't stoppin'." The stadium quaked, a seismic wave of triumph, and Calvin stood, chest heaving, the beat fading, their love a tide that lifted him higher than ever. Backstage he collapsed into a chair, sweat-soaked, his breath ragged, Kevin's hand slamming his shoulder. "You owned it, Cal, owned the damn world," Kevin said, voice thick with awe. Mia slipped in, her cafe days traded for a tour jacket, her blue eyes shining as she hugged him, fierce and warm. "You're a force, Calvin," she whispered, and he nodded, his throat tight, her words a mirror to the strength he'd reclaimed. The crew swarmed, producers, fans, VIPs, but Calvin's phone buzzed, Kevin's assistant waving it urgently. "Boss, you need to see this, now." Calvin took it, his pulse spiking, the screen flashing a news alert. "Prison leak. Daniel Harris releases statement from cell." His stomach twisted, a cold fist clenching his gut, and he tapped play, the grainy video filling the screen. Harris sat in an orange jumpsuit, his light brown hair greasy, his green eyes hollow but glinting with a venom that hadn't died. His voice rasped, low and jagged, "Calvin Jones, Big C, thinks he's won, thinks he's buried me. He's a fraud, a thug who played the victim, turned the world against me. I'd do it again, throw him out, watch him sink, 'cause he don't belong, never will. This ain't over, you hear me? Not while I'm breathing." The video cut and silence fell, heavy as lead. Kevin cursed, a string of filth that echoed Calvin's own, while Mia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with dread. Calvin stared at the screen, his breath shallow, Harris's words a dagger twisting in his chest. "I'd do it again," a taunt that dragged him back to the jet, the ropes, the plunge. The whisper flared, "He's still here, still fighting," and his fists clenched, nails digging into his palms until blood welled, the old rage surging like a tide he thought he'd tamed. Inside he was a battlefield reborn. He saw Harris's sneer, felt the fists, tasted the ocean, and the fire roared, not clean now but wild, a street kid's fury clawing free. He wanted to storm that prison, smash through bars, Make Harris eat those words, feel the terror Calvin had felt plummeting into the dark. It scared him how alive it felt, how it pulsed in his veins like a beat he couldn't stop. He'd won, trial, tour, the world, but Harris's voice was a splinter, a ghost that wouldn't die, and Calvin teetered on the edge, the man he'd become wrestling the shadow he'd buried. Kevin grabbed his arm, voice sharp, "Cal, don't let him in your head. He's done, locked up, powerless. This is just noise." Mia nodded, her hand on his other arm, steadying him. "He's lashing out 'cause you won, Calvin, he's got nothing left." Calvin exhaled, ragged, his dark eyes flickering between them, the phone trembling in his grip. "He's still breathing," he rasped, voice low, lethal. "Still talking like he owns me." Kevin's jaw tightened, his grip firm. "He don't own shit, Cal, you do. You're on that stage, he's in a cage. End it your way." Calvin nodded, slow, the fire banking, not gone but controlled, a weapon he'd wield, not wield him. He handed the phone back, his voice a growl, "Get me live, now." Kevin's team scrambled, a camera rigged in seconds, the red light blinking like a heartbeat as millions tuned in. Big C Live from Wembley, the chat exploding. "What's happening? Harris again? We're with you." A tidal wave of support he felt through the lens. He faced it, hoodie sweat-soaked, scar glinting, his voice a thunderclap that silenced the world. "Yo, it's Big C, straight from London, still standin', still unbroken," he said, steady but raw, the edge cutting deep. "Harris just ran his mouth from a cell, says he'd do it again, throw me out, watch me sink. Says I don't belong." He paused, his dark eyes blazing, the crowd's distant roar a heartbeat behind him. "He tied me, beat me, dropped me in the ocean, thought he'd kill me. But I rose, I breathed, and I'm here, 90,000 strong tonight, millions with me worldwide. He's caged, finished, a ghost screamin' at shadows, but I'm the storm now and I ain't stoppin'. The chat erupted, "Fuck Harris. You're the king, Big C. Unbreakable." A storm of love and fury that drowned the whisper, smothered Harris's echo. Calvin leaned closer, voice dropping to a growl, "This ain't about him no more, it's about us. Everyone who's been kicked down told we're less, we're the beat, the fire, the sky. I belong, we belong, and no cell, no hate, no ghost can take that. This is my final word, Harris, you're done and I'm forever." He slammed the mic down, the thud a gunshot, and Kevin cut the feed, the screen dark but the world alight. The video went nuclear, trending globally, fans flooding streets from LA to London, #unbreakable, a war cry that shook the earth. Calvin sank into a chair, his breath ragged, the fire cooling to a glow, not gone but his, a strength he'd claimed. Kevin clapped his shoulder, voice thick, "You buried him, Cal, for good." Mia hugged him, her tears warm against his neck, and he nodded, the knot in his chest unraveling, the whisper silenced, not by force but by truth. Weeks later the tour roared on, Paris, Tokyo, Sydney, each night a thunderclap, Calvin's beat a force that bent the world to his will. He'd visit the fishing village soon, Amos, Maria, Javi, build them a studio, repay the hands that pulled him from the waves. He'd call Mia, keep her close, a sister forged in scars. But tonight, in a quiet Sydney hotel, he stood on the balcony, the ocean a silver shimmer below, the sky a canvas of stars. He saw Harris's broken silhouette, heard the cuffs, felt the plunge, but they were dust now, powerless, a memory he'd outgrown. He breathed, long and slow, the ember in his chest a steady light, not rage but legacy, a fire he'd mastered. The street kid was there, a flicker he'd carry, but he was more, Big C, the survivor, the icon, the man who'd turned hell into a hymn. Harris was ash, the whisper gone, and Calvin Jones stood tall, his beat a thunder that'd echo beyond him, a rhythm of the unbreakable, forever.